In today's video, I'm going to be discussing my evidence for teaching standard 1, setting high expectations. So the start point for me for this standard was my subject knowledge audit for Javelin. And if you scroll down on this document, then you'll find out that whilst I feel like I've got a reasonable grasp of teaching Javelin, the reality is that this was all in a more traditionalist setting, whereby the sole outcome was how far somebody could throw. So although I might have been able to set high expectations of pupils who naturally gravitate towards the sport of javelin, it was unlikely that I was able to set high expectations which stretched and challenged other learners. So although I felt like I had a reasonable understanding of the technical model, putting this into practice in terms of stretching and challenging all pupils with high expectations, I felt would have been difficult without some additional improvements or professional development. So having taught javelin for 2 years during my previous role, as I said, felt reasonably confident from a technical perspective, but the reality is I probably wasn't delivering lessons in a manner that was stimulating for all pupils, and therefore certain pupils' progress would undoubtedly have been hindered. So what I looked to do following this reflection was go about finding out ways of teaching javelin in a way that were more inclusive to all pupils and where I could set high expectations of all pupils, not just the ones who could throw far. So in doing so, I stumbled across a blog which discussed innovative ways of teaching the javelin, and naturally I wanted to focus on planning lessons that were fun and engaging for all learners, not just those who are naturally sporty. So in doing so, this blog that I stumbled across discussed about using various different implements such as American footballs, vortexes, foam javelins, in order to challenge all pupils and to give pupils an appropriate item to throw with, because even with javelins that might be lighter than the regulation javelin for a certain year group, even these might be too difficult for certain pupils to throw. And equally, the skill might be quite novel because there's very few skills that pupils might have learned in the PE curriculum from which they can draw on and transfer into throwing the javelin. So the key points that I picked up from looking at this blog was that making sure it's fun and engaging, ensuring that athletes or pupils have the maximum number of attempts within the shortest time frame possible, because the traditionalist way of teaching javelin eats up a lot of time just because of the natural safety concerns, and making sure that I was positioned in such a way that I could watch all pupils at all times. So what I took from this and how I implemented what I learned from this blog into my lesson plan was we decided to take away all the use of actual javelins. Now, whilst there was 2 gifted and talented pupils within the class that this lesson plan was for, the main aims of the lesson was to know the teaching points of the javelin technique, to be able to apply these using an implement of choice, and to be able to evaluate partners or peers' performance against these teaching points. So starting to focus more on the technique and being able to verbally describe and or demonstrate the technique as opposed to just simply measuring the distance as our outcome measure. So I felt by doing so, every pupil had a chance to be to learn within the lesson. I felt every pupil had the chance to be stretched and challenged, and by having a variety of different equipment and planning my lesson in the way that I'm about to describe, I felt like I was able to set high expectations of all pupils. So firstly, if I look at the safety considerations, so even though pupils weren't actually throwing javelins per se, obviously items are still being thrown, so pupils still need to be instructed on the safety points, so pupils feel like the environment's not just stimulating and fun and engaging, but also that they're obviously going to be safe. So even though the pupils weren't actually throwing proper javelins, there were still expectations set in terms of how pupils would collect their javelins. So by by using pupils' ability to verbally describe the javelin throw, this then gave me the opportunity to put pupils into groups. And by being able to do so just on pupils' ability to describe it, that also meant that pupils who are more likely to know the technical points are probably going to be more likely to be able to demonstrate them, or at least you'd hope so anyway. And given that we use different pieces of equipment, I've also looked to cater for pupils who might have struggled with the actual javelin itself. So in regards to what that might look like in a lesson format, so we'd have Team A throwing over shorter distances in the cones marked on the on the left-hand side of this final column. That would be separated by quite a reasonable distance between Zone B, which is slightly further, and C, which is slightly further even more. Now, even though the lesson isn't focusing on distance, this is more for logistics' sake and safety, just in the regards of pupils who will throw their implement further will then have to wait longer before they grab the implement and come back. Pupils are then given the chance to take themselves through resource cards, which allows them to use a guided discovery method in order to learn the technique that best suits them. And also there's means of catering for gifted and talented, because those pupils are going to have a run up for a throw, so you can set the expectation that they will be able to demonstrate that and explain and demonstrate the technique for throwing with a run up. And pupils who might struggle are still going to learn which technique feels most appropriate for them, and they're still going to undergo higher order thinking in terms of being able to evaluate these techniques in relation to each other. By using the battleships games and this other target practice game, pupils are still going to be focusing on the technique of their throw as opposed to how far it is, but we can still allow for some differentiation with smaller targets. And there's also several different ways that pupils are being challenged. So pupils are still having access to the learning, pupils are still having high expectations set, because regardless of what they're throwing, they can still be challenged in line of the technical model. And finally, what I would hope to see as a result of that, so this is the resource card that pupils will be given for the guided discovery throws. So what we're looking for is that pupils attempt to throw from each of the positions, and this gets them thinking about which position felt the best for them. Pupils are then going to write this down on their whiteboard, but there's also some stretch and challenge tasks. So where pupils can understand that although there might be a technical model that might be preferred, they're still understanding and they're almost self-teaching themselves as to why this is best. Because even if the answers that they generate are wrong, it still gives us a chance to have a discussion on what other groups thought, whether they could improve on the answers, and gives you a really nice way of working out whether the guided discovery method was an effective way of teaching the pupils, and whether my use of different implemented equipment and throwing from different positions actually enabled pupils to reach the learning objective. So what I would expect to see from here is that pupils would hopefully circle position 6, where they are side on with the opposite foot forward to the throwing hand. That even though all the throws are thrown from different positions, we're still seeing a high elbow position. And for pupils, the gifted and talented or the higher ability pupils, they should hopefully be able to recognize that even though a javelin throw from a seated position is obviously going to be harder because you can't quite use your legs, they still hopefully identify elements such as being side on to the target or having a high elbow position. So really getting pupils to think about that position and how it relates to the learning objective, rather than simply being told that that's the position and them having to simply reiterate that fact. So for a more detailed or in-depth version of the lesson plan, you can go to 2 minutes 20 into the Javelin lesson plan and until 0.620. And as I said, from my predictive impact standpoint, I would expect all pupils to demonstrate or at least be able to describe the key technique points because they're not limited by the use of equipment. They'd also have a chance to experiment throwing from a variety of different positions. They get lots of practice in, which would hopefully allow them to better evaluate which technique they felt was most effective for them, and then potentially justify it. And this should also provide a means of some effective and some productive group discussions, as well as them adding this to the whiteboard task.